The DNA results from Michael Jackson's ancestry testing did not reveal what anyone expected. Not a paternity question, not a celebrity scandal, something far older and stranger than that. Researchers tracing his maternal bloodline found a genetic signature that does not belong in a Mississippi family by any conventional historical explanation, one that points toward a part of Africa most people never connect to the American slave trade. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why that matters. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and subscribe. Here's what most people think they know about African American ancestry. West Africa, the slave ships, the Middle Passage, the plantations of the American South. That narrative is broadly true, and it represents the largest single forced migration in human history. But broadly true is not the same as complete, and when it comes to where African American families actually originated genetically, geographically, ancestrally, the full picture is far more complicated, far more fragmented, and in many cases far more surprising than the version most of us were taught. The transatlantic slave trade operated for roughly 4 centuries. It moved an estimated 12 million people from Africa to the Americas. The majority of enslaved people brought to North America came from a broad coastal corridor stretching from Senegambia down through the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, and into Central Africa. These are the origins that dominate the African American genetic record. When a Black American family takes a DNA test today and sees results pointing to Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, or the Congo, that is the slave trade made visible in a laboratory. But the trade was not a single pipeline. It was a network, a brutal, chaotic, commercially driven network that moved human beings across distances and through systems that left almost no traceable record for the people inside them. Ships changed routes, enslaved people were sold and resold. Regional African populations that were never supposed to enter the Atlantic system sometimes did through secondary markets, through Arab intermediaries, through the internal American slave trade that continued moving people across the continent long after the international trade was officially banned in 1808. This matters because when geneticists began applying modern DNA tools to African American ancestry, they started finding things that did not fit the expected map. Markers from regions nobody predicted, lineages that pointed somewhere other than the West African coast, results that raised questions the historical record could not easily answer. Michael Jackson's family is one of those cases, and the question his maternal DNA raises is not a small one. It goes directly to the heart of how the slave trade actually worked and how much of it we still do not fully understand. To understand what the DNA revealed, you have to understand where Michael Jackson's family actually came from. Joseph Jackson was born in Fountain Hill, Arkansas in 1928. His family were sharecroppers, part of the vast rural Black population of the American South, living in conditions barely removed from the plantation economy that slavery had created. Joseph's father, Samuel Jackson, worked the land. His grandfather before him had been enslaved. The paper trail, thin as it already was, runs out sometime in the 1860s, swallowed by the silence that surrounds every enslaved family in American records. Catherine Screws was born in Barber County, Alabama in 1930. Her family moved to East Chicago, Indiana when she was a child, part of the Great Migration that pulled millions of Black Americans north between 1910 and 1970, chasing factory work and distance from the racial violence of the South. Her parents, Prince Albert Screws and Martha Upshaw, were themselves children of sharecroppers. Go back one more generation and the records dissolve in the same way they do for almost every African American family that traces its roots to the rural South. A name appears in a census, then another census, then nothing. The plantation records that survive from before emancipation don't list family relationships. They list property, ages sometimes, first names sometimes, never origins. This is the genealogical wall that sits in almost every African American family tree. Not a mystery in the conventional sense, not a secret someone kept, a deliberate erasure, built into the legal and administrative structure of American slavery. Enslaved people were not permitted surnames. They were not permitted to record their own histories. The African languages, naming traditions, and regional identities that survived the Middle Passage were systematically stripped away across generations. For the Jackson and Screws families, as for millions of others, that wall sits somewhere around 1865. Before emancipation, the names disappear, the places disappear, the connections to specific African regions disappear entirely. And that is exactly what DNA testing was designed to reach across. The question was what it would find on the other side. Here is what you need to understand about DNA testing and African American ancestry before the results mean anything. When a person takes a consumer ancestry test today, they receive two fundamentally different kinds of information. The first is autosomal DNA, genetic material inherited from both parents mixing and recombining with every generation. Autosomal results give you a broad ethnic percentage breakdown. They tell you roughly what populations contributed to your overall genome. For most African Americans, those results show a mix of sub-Saharan African ancestry, a percentage of European ancestry that is almost always a direct legacy of sexual violence during slavery, and sometimes smaller markers from other populations. Useful, informative, but because autosomal DNA mixes with every generation, it becomes less precise the further back you go. The second type is mitochondrial DNA. This is different in a fundamental way. Mitochondrial DNA is passed exclusively from mother to child, unchanged, generation after generation. A woman today carries the same mitochondrial sequence as her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and every woman in that unbroken maternal line stretching back centuries. It does not mix. It does not dilute. It is, in genetic terms, a direct line of inheritance running straight back through time. This is the tool that produces the most specific and often the most surprising results for maternal ancestry, and it is the tool that matters most for what was found in Michael Jackson's family line. But here's where it gets complicated. Mitochondrial DNA tells you only one story, the story of one woman in each generation, the direct maternal line. It cannot tell you about the other women in the family tree, or the men, or the hundreds of other ancestors whose contributions are visible only in the autosomal results. A mitochondrial haplogroup is not a complete portrait of a person's ancestry. It is a single thread pulled from an enormously complex weave. Geneticists who work with African American ancestry are careful about this. They know that a single unexpected haplogroup result can be real, confirmed, and scientifically significant, while simultaneously representing just one ancestor among thousands. The result does not define the whole, but it does reveal something true. And what it revealed in this case was not what anyone was looking for. When researchers and genealogists began examining Michael Jackson's ancestry through the tool available to modern genetic genealogy, the autosomal results told a story that was entirely consistent with what history would predict. His ancestry was predominantly sub-Saharan African. That was expected. His family had been in the American South for generations, enslaved before emancipation, sharecropping after it, carrying the genetic record of that history in their DNA, the same way millions of other African American families do. The European ancestry percentage that showed up was also consistent with the historical record, not surprising, not anomalous, a quiet confirmation of what slavery did to black families across the South over 2 centuries. There were traces of other markers. Some results suggested possible Native American ancestry in the broader family line, which again is not unusual for African American families from Alabama and Mississippi. Indigenous populations interacted with, lived alongside, and were sometimes forcibly integrated into the same brutal labor systems as enslaved Africans. Their genetic presence in African American family trees is documented across thousands of tested families. Nothing in the autosomal picture stood out as historically unexplainable. This is important to establish. Because when something genuinely unexpected shows up in a DNA result, the first question any serious researcher asks is whether it fits any known pattern. For Michael Jackson's broader ancestry, the answer was yes. The broad picture was consistent. The historical logic held. And then there was the maternal haplogroup. The maternal haplogroup, the mitochondrial DNA, the single unbroken line of inheritance running through Katherine Jackson, her mother, her grandmother, and back through every woman in that maternal chain into the 19th century and beyond, told a different story. Not a contradictory story, not an impossible one, but one that did not fit the expected map of a black family from rural Alabama with roots in the antebellum South. The haplogroup that came back was not one of the common West African or Central African markers that dominate the African American genetic record. It pointed somewhere else entirely, somewhere that raises an immediate and specific historical question, and that question does not have a simple answer. The maternal haplogroup that came back from Michael Jackson's family line was L3. That designation alone won't mean much to most people, but in genetic genealogy, haplogroup placement is everything. It tells you not just what region your ancestors came from, but when and how a particular human population moved across the world. And L3 has a specific story, one that starts in East Africa and takes a very particular path through human history. Here's what you need to understand. Haplogroup L3 is ancient. It originated in East Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, and it is considered one of the most significant haplogroups in human genetic history because it is the direct ancestor of every non-African haplogroup on the planet. Every human being whose ancestors left Africa carries a lineage that descended from L3. But L3 itself, in its various subclades, remain concentrated in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and the Great Rift Valley region. These are the populations where L3 and its immediate subclades are found at the highest frequencies today. This is not a West African haplogroup. The West and Central African populations that supplied the overwhelming majority of enslaved people taken to North America carry predominantly different haplogroup distributions. L1, L2, and specific subclades of L3 that are geographically distinct from the East African concentrations. What showed up in Katherine Jackson's maternal line was a subclade pointing specifically toward the Horn of Africa and the East African corridor, not the Gold Coast, not the Niger Delta, not the Congo Basin. For a family from rural Alabama, that is statistically unexpected. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the maternal line running through Catherine Scroose's family, through the sharecroppers of Alabama, through the unnamed enslaved women in the plantation records that do not record their origins, there was a woman whose people came from the other side of the African continent, not from the populations that defined the transatlantic slave trade to North America, from somewhere else entirely. How she got there is the question. The answer requires understanding something about the slave trade that most history classes never teach. Most people learn one version of the slave trade. Ships left European ports, stopped on the West African coast, loaded enslaved people, and crossed the Atlantic. That version is accurate for the majority of the trade, but it is not the whole story. The East African slave trade operated on a completely different axis. For centuries before the transatlantic trade even began, Arab merchants had been moving enslaved East Africans through the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Persia, to the Indian subcontinent. This was an older system, a larger system in some respects, and one that ran parallel to the Atlantic trade for the entire period of European colonialism. It is estimated that the Indian Ocean slave trade moved somewhere between 12 and 17 million people out of East Africa over its full duration. Those numbers rival the transatlantic trade. Most Western history curricula never mention them, but here's where the two systems intersected. After the United States banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808, the domestic slave trade exploded. Enslaved people were bought, sold, and transported across enormous distances within the country, from the upper South to the deep South, from coastal states to the expanding cotton frontier of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This internal trade moved over 1 million people in the decades before the Civil War. It was its own forced migration, within the forced migration that had already happened, and the populations it moved were not uniform. By the early 19th century, East African enslaved people had been entering Atlantic ports through secondary routes for generations, through Cape Verde, through Brazil, through the Caribbean, re-exported and resold until their specific origins were completely untraceable in any written record. A woman with East African ancestry could arrive in Alabama in 1840 through a chain of transactions that began in Mozambique, passed through a Brazilian port, continued to New Orleans, and ended on a cotton plantation without a single document recording anything about her except her estimated age and her sale price. The paper trail ends, the DNA does not. That is exactly the kind of pathway that would produce an East African maternal haplogroup in a Black Alabama family, and that is exactly what the evidence points toward. The Jackson family result is not an outlier, it is a pattern. As DNA testing has expanded across African American communities over the past 2 decades, geneticists and genealogists have consistently found maternal haplogroups that do not match the expected West African profile, East African markers, Horn of Africa signatures, lineages pointing toward regions that the standard slave trade narrative does not account for. These results appear across families from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, the heart of the antebellum plantation South. They are not common, but they are not rare enough to be dismissed as anomalies. What they represent is a more accurate map of how the slave trade actually moved human beings. Not a clean corridor from West Africa to North America, but a web, a system of systems. The transatlantic trade, the Indian Ocean trade, the internal American trade, the Caribbean re-export routes, all feeding into each other and erasing origins as they move people further from home. The genetic record is now revealing the geography of that web in ways the written record never could. For African American families, this matters in a specific and deeply personal way. The narrative of West African roots, the kente cloth, the specific ethnic identities, the connection to Yoruba or Ashanti or Wolof heritage has been enormously important culturally and psychologically. It gave communities a connection to something that slavery tried to destroy. DNA testing has largely confirmed and deepened that connection for millions of families, but it has also revealed that some African American families carry ancestral lines that do not fit that geography. Their roots stretch to places their cultural narrative never pointed them toward. That does not diminish the narrative. It complicates it in a way that is historically honest. The slave trade did not care about cultural coherence. It did not sort people by ethnicity or region. It took whoever was available, moved them wherever profit demanded, and left no record of what was lost. DNA is recovering fragments of what the trade destroyed. And in Michael Jackson's maternal line, one of those fragments points somewhere specific, somewhere ancient, somewhere that changes the story his family could tell about where they came from. Michael Jackson knew where he came from in the ways that mattered to him. He grew up in Gary, Indiana, in a house that held the weight of everything his family had climbed through to get there. Catherine's people had left Alabama during the Great Migration, carrying nothing except the determination that their children would not live the way they had lived. Joseph's family had done the same from Arkansas, 2 lines of Black Americans who had survived slavery, survived sharecropping, survived the racial violence of the Jim Crow South, and arrived in a northern industrial city looking for something better. That history shaped Michael Jackson explicitly. It showed up in his work, the references to Black American experience, the Pan-African imagery in his later films and albums, the awareness of a history that ran deeper than celebrity. These were not accidental. He understood that he was the product of something long and hard. He could not have known the specific genetic details of his maternal ancestry. No test had told him that one of the women in his mother's line carried a haplogroup pointing toward the Horn of Africa, but he knew in the way that Black Americans who engage honestly with their history know. that the full story of where his people came from was buried somewhere beyond what any record could recover. And now a fragment of that buried story has a direction. The maternal line running through Katherine Jackson traces back through the silence of plantation records and the violence of the domestic slave trade to a woman whose people were not from the Gold Coast or the Niger Delta. They were from the other side of the continent, East Africa, the Horn, a region whose people entered the Atlantic system through routes that history barely documented and memory could not preserve. That woman's name is gone. The circumstances that brought her into the American slave system are gone. Everything about her individual life has been erased by the same machinery that erased millions of others. But her DNA survived. It passed through every woman in that line, generation after generation, through the sharecroppers of Alabama and the factory workers of Indiana, until it arrived here. What the DNA confirmed is not a scandal, it is a depth. Michael Jackson's maternal line carries a genetic signature that points toward East Africa, and through the tangled, violent geography of a slave trade most people were never taught to understand fully. The name of the woman who carried that lineage into America will never be known. It was never recorded, but her DNA survived every system designed to erase her, and through it, something true about the cost and reach of American slavery endures.